Offsite culture.
Artists talk about art.
In terms of the family, I'm the only person who's ever gone into the arts. I think a big part of the entry into the arts was, the neighborhood that I grew up in, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in the late '80s, early '90s, was difficult. It was a tough place. So I was bored. I was bored often, and I was indoors often. My mom was very nervous, right, about letting me out because there was a lot of drugs, a lot of gun violence, a lot of gang activity, a lot of nonsense. But I was a reader. I really liked to read. And so I went to the library very, very often. So I would go and I would pick up books and I would read. And like any other kid, you were watching TV and you were doing these things. I don't know if I have ADHD or it's one of those things, but it's not impossible. I was smart enough that I could pass my tests and do other things. So I was just bored in class. And so I would draw in the margins. And then, you get attention for drawing silly things. And I mean, if we want to go back to that sort of like nascent, like where the art came from, a lot of it came from just trying to copy things that we were all interested in, right? And I think that that's pretty natural for kids, is maybe you want to recreate this aspect of a story that you're interested in, or you want to see how someone drew some character or something else that you were interested in. I remember that very clearly. Like I had notebooks where I just, like, every page, instead of doing homework or instead of doing my assignments or copying notes, I did drawings. I really like the idea of the kind of time spent in front of a canvas, making decisions, or making portraits of people or drawing scenes from life or something like that. But eventually it became much more about like material and color. At the same time, I was making photographs with like a little cheap point and shoot camera that my mom had. And I was using those photographs from my neighborhood as reference. So I was just getting them developed at like the Rite Aid, and then I would come in and put them on the wall, and I would take parts of those things and synthesize it and make paintings and sort of abstract it. And I don't know that they were any good, but I was trying. And I was really interested in it. But the Cooper Union is a very conceptual kind of school. It's very much about like theory. I think at the time I was very interested in process and narrative. It's something that narrative has really continued in my work. And this is all to say that very quickly I grew very disillusioned with the conversations around painting. I started to kind of hate the process. I was young and I was idealistic and I was all those things. And so I felt like it was just much too disconnected from the kind of experience that I was coming from. I was part of a very small cohort of Latino students in that school. I was also not a rich kid. I was coming from a background of living in a Latino enclave in one of the worst neighborhoods in New York City at the time. A lot of the paintings that I was making was about like trying to kind of parse that experience and talk about those things. They were kind of hostile to that kind of presentation. It always felt to me like there wasn't a lot of generosity to the idea of a narrative in the painting. I felt like it was basically telling me that the things that I was talking about weren't worth talking about. On the more positive side of that, the photography that I was doing on the street started to resonate a little bit more with me. And then I decided to take a photo class. I took a photo 1 class, a darkroom class, like a everyday sort of black and white, 35 millimeter, go out into the street, come back, develop. And I've always liked process. Like I've always liked the idea of things being measured just so, and timing and that kind of thing. That resonated right away with me. You put in the first images in the bath and they come out and it's magic. And from that moment on, I just did photo. It was nothing but photo. And very quickly, I mean, I think I did 35 millimeter for like a month. And then I immediately moved to medium format and started buying, bigger film and started making bigger print. And then I worked on this sort of documentary project, which were these long exposure night photographs of Williamsburg. And I printed them really huge in color. So I was all in the darkroom. And that sort of laid the groundwork for all the other work that I ended up doing. I really like the technical things that were going on. I liked how the optical kind of view of the camera changed the world in a way that I think resonated more than the paintings obviously were. And then on top of that, there was this direct kind of like one-to-one of like, I'm here, this is what I'm pointing my camera at. This is what matters. Here is its relationship to the story, whatever that story was. I graduated with this big show of these huge photographs, these night images. I immediately got invited to do a show at a gallery called Art in General in New York City. And I had a bunch of my work shown. I was written up in the New York Times for these pictures and everything else. But by the time all that stuff happened, I was exhausted. I burnt out. So what I ended up doing was I quit I did work for artists, like, so that was one of the ways that I made money for a couple years while I was kind of figuring things out. I assisted a lot of artists in production, in video production, and in documenting their work. So that's what I did for a little while, but I was like, I want to get out. And so I started to do construction work. I got another job. I got a job again at the Cooper Union teaching in the same program that I was a high school student. And a lot of the conversations that I had with some of the students were really like reminiscent. A lot of the concerns with especially folks of color about being in the arts is whether or not you can make a life out of it, right? I remember the day that I got into the Cooper Union, I opened the letter and I was ecstatic and I showed my mom and she was excited and I was happy and I was sort of calling people. And then, we have the sort of Dominican network and, an aunt calls an aunt, calls an uncle, calls a cousin, calls somebody else. And then my dad found out. My dad's a doctor. And all his kids, they're all in medicine. I remember the phone ringing, my mom picking it up, and I could hear my dad yelling from the other room. Why did she let me do that? Saying all kinds of like really sort of awful things about the fact that I was going to be like a useless person or whatever else. And I remember getting the phone and I remember just hanging up because in my mind, I was like, the decision is made, right? So I had a lot of students say, well, how do I make a life? How do I make a living? How do I do this? I was still like, listen, I just got out of school. These are the things that I'm doing. I'm living here in New York. I'm making this work. And I worked there for 11 years as a teacher and also as an admin / sort of like computer photography person for that program. So all of those skills that I learned in college translated to this particular kind of job in the arts. I think that that's the thing that we have to balance is that it's not unreasonable. This is not easy. There is a lot of this life that is diligence and hard work and vision, but there's so much of it that is equally luck and network and advertise like self-promotion. Anytime you have a major fair come into a city, it brings people here that otherwise wouldn't come here. It brings people to look at artwork that otherwise wouldn't, including, and we're talking about like from blue chip folks who can afford to fly in and buy a bunch of work and invest and leave to just Joe Blow off the street who says, what is this? Having taken part in Photo Miami last year, like most of the traffic that we got were people who were just like looking in and interested and came in and got to see work and got to talk to people. And shows came out of that and some sales came out of that. And that's all great. So I think in that respect, it has a kind of splash effect, right? Art Basel is one place. So people look for other things to look at and do. That's really positive. If people can kind of like ride that wave and if they're smart about it, if they can get spaces, that's all amazing. And I think it's a good thing in terms of a market. That being said, it happens in Miami, but it's not about Miami, right? You're thinking about major galleries and organizations coming down, selling work from all over the world of artists who are from all over the world. It's investment capital, right? It's not exactly like, let's find some quirky artist who's making something interesting in this way. It's like it's very elite in some ways. It's not like someone is being discovered through that unless you are an artist who is already established in some kind of gallery who happens to be selling or doing something there at the same time. So those graduate students get people coming to see work, they get exposure. But part of that is because we have a certain amount of means. So when you're talking about other aspects of the art community in the area, I think the problem is the same as the problem would be in New York or anywhere else, is that space is a premium at that time, attention is a premium, and then you have things like the network, which is a premium. So it's a question that I don't know that I have a good answer to. The questions about like accessible, like who gets access to those things is a question that is always an issue. The art world is small. And as much as we like to think of ourselves as intersectional and having all these kind of things coming from all these other places, the reality is that that's not real, or at least it's not as real as we pretend to be or want it to be. The art world is small. Who do you know? Who is showing with whom? Who has access to whom? Miami is a big, expensive city, right? New York is a big, expensive city. LA is a big, expensive city. Whose kind of skin in the game is not driven by profit. I think that those things are never going to be easy. Ideally, you would have some kind of art space who's like you, but if part of the interest is economic, right? Selling work, getting a commission, like 50% commission or 30% or whatever it is, and paying for the rent for a new space so that you can show adjacent to wherever, I think those things necessarily will incur costs that for some artists, unfortunately, are difficult to justify. I've applied to things where I've gotten in And then they go, okay, and here now you need to pay $700 for a 2 foot by 2 foot wall where you could put one piece. I mean, like, I have funding, right? And I'm a professor here. I can decide, and it's not that I have a lot of money or anything, but I keep that into account because it's part of my practice. And maybe I could do that once, right, a year. But imagine someone who is an artist, someone who's working, not that it's not had nothing to do with like who they are or where they are, but that their life situation doesn't allow them to pop $700 or $800 or $1,000 for a little bit of space. I think that's the biggest difficulty. That's the biggest obstacles to real community engagement. It's funding, it's money. The one thing that Miami has going for it, which I think is very different than New York, is that there is a market here for people's work to be bought. There are people here who do buy. We've had students who their work goes up in the gallery and someone walks in and goes, I want these 2 paintings. That just doesn't happen in New York City in the same way. And I have some friends in New York City who are small curators. And one of the things that they have been doing a lot more of is curating shows where the works are no more than $250. Because there is such a huge gap between that very high end of people who could buy multiple pieces and someone who maybe would buy something because they're interested in it or because they want something for their home or whatever else. And you see that with these high-end galleries all over the place that are closing. That market is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking because you cannot cater to this echelon of people and expect them to do all the buying that you need them to do in order for a market, for an art world to be sort of supported. Yeah. So I don't know where this goes. Photography is a whole different beast. Anybody can make a picture. And it's true, anybody can make a picture. But phones now are incredible. You don't need like a high-end camera to make a beautiful image and to be able to print a really beautiful image. The fact of printing, of the idea of the multiple, you can print, I could print 200 exactly the same image, right? So I think all of those things for photography create a fact of the marketplace that is very different to the sort of rarity value that gets sort of automatically added to things like a painting or a sculpture or something else. And you see that in the market at large. If we're talking about photography in particular, it's a really tough market. Unless you're already a very well-established photographer, your sales are just not happening for you in that way, which is why a large portion of the photography world, work that is about the personal, work that is poetic, beautifully made and all those things, but where the dimension is not necessarily like, it's not fashion, it's not commercial work. A lot of that world, for good and sometimes for ill, has moved away from the idea of the gallery and moved into the idea of the book. That is actually, in a lot of ways, a much more feasible way to get your work out there and to get people to look at your work and perhaps even to purchase your work. Seeing work, being able to go to museums and galleries. And then when I was in high school, being in this program that I mentioned, where one of the things that they did is they had funding to take the class to do studio visits. That was, for me, was a big deal and something that I try to replicate here as much as I can. Because in that program, we would go to, every Saturday, we would go visit 1 or 2 artists and we would go to their studio and see they're working on things. And the reason why I have that anecdote is, for me as a high school student, that question again of like access, who gets to live that life, right? Some of the ideas of who gets to be an artist or who gets to be involved in the arts are very much based on class divisions and educational divisions. So as a student, before I sort of made the decision to go into art school, that question of like, how do I make a live, like who lives this life, right? Who makes this thing was not clear to me until I had that community access. Going to class on a Saturday to do drawings and paintings, being taken to a person's home/studio, and me walking in and going and seeing the person talk and being like, so you make your coffee and you kneel here and you sleep there, but here's the studio part and you paint or you draw and you've had these shows and here's this thing you're doing. Or going to a gallery and seeing that the gallery is a place that like people work at and present and package and discuss. And for me, that was really eye-opening. And I think often when we talk about this idea of like bringing the community in, it can't just be like field trip situation where you come in, you see something for a few hours, isn't this nice, and then go back to your life. It has to be brought in such a way that it does become part of the culture to do those things, right? So I think before we answer those questions of the community and involving them, is how do you make that relevant to the community? When I was a high school student, I was in art school, but I had a moment where I was like, I don't know that this is working. I'm doing all this stuff. I'm trying to get into programs. I'm trying to get into school. I couldn't see the sort of end of it. So when, I had family who were in the army. So one of the things that I did is I went to the recruitment office on 42nd Street in New York City, and I got paperwork, and they tried to recruit me right then and there. And I said, no, I want to read the stuff. But I remember having the stuff because I was like, well, I'm going to try to do this, or I'm going in here. I'm going to the army. And so one was aspirational and a dream and this thing, but I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to work out for me. And the other one, I had plan B, and it was real. It was a uniform. It was a duty and a task, and it was a life that I knew other people lived. So if it wasn't for the fact that I got to go into people's homes and studios and see how they made a life, if it wasn't because I got to hands-on do it myself and see how it worked, if it wasn't for those experiences, that would have been, even with my interest, my real interest in it, it would have been just way too amorphous. And so I may have eventually sort of decided that it wasn't real enough for me to actually bother with. So if you were going to talk about bringing in the community, it cannot just be an event-based thing, or it shouldn't be. It can be part of that. Sometimes you need someone who is part of the community, who's made a certain kind of work, and invite everybody in. I think that's great. And I got a lot out of those things. But I think the other parts is where you're going to get past those questions of relevance, that question of whether or not you're making a mistake in terms of like making a living. And those are more difficult questions to answer when so much of the arts feels esoteric, feels completely disconnected from what we see everybody doing every day. But if you can bridge that gap, then you build that culture where people go, okay, this is really interesting. This is something that's amazing.
Off-site culture.
Artists talk about art.